Clara Whitmore did not cry when Edward Bellamy's letter hit the floor. She picked it up, read it twice, and set it in the fireplace. Not because she was strong, but because she had nothing left to burn except her pride. The house was cold. The debts were real. And she was 27 years old with no fiancé, no fortune, and no future. If you've ever been left standing in a room where everything you counted on just disappeared, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in June of 1816, and it was shorter than Clara expected. She had imagined in the private hours before sleep that if Edward Bellamy ever ended things, he would at least have the decency to look her in the face. She had imagined an argument, her voice, his excuses, maybe tears on one side or both. She had imagined that a man who had kissed her hand in her father's parlor and called her the finest woman in Boston would not reduce 4 years of courtship to 9 cold sentences on cream-colored paper. She was wrong. The letter sat on the breakfast table beside a cup of tea that had gone cold. Clara's maid, Ruth Albright, stood near the doorway with her hands folded tight across her apron, watching Clara's face with the careful stillness of a woman who already knew what that envelope contained and was bracing herself for the sound of something breaking. Nothing broke. Clara read the letter, set it down, picked it up, read it again, set it in the fireplace grate where it curled slowly into ash against the blackened iron. "Well," she said to no one in particular. Ruth pressed her lips together. "Miss Clara." "He blamed my father," Clara said, not like a question, like someone reading a fact from a ledger. 9 sentences, and 3 of them were about the debts. "Men of his kind protect their investment first," Ruth said quietly. "You know that. I knew it about other men." Clara turned from the fireplace. "I thought Edward was different." She stood in the middle of what had once been the finest parlor in the Whitmore house on Beacon Hill. At one time this room had held 60 guests for her father's annual merchant supper. It had held music, laughter, candlelight, and the kind of comfortable certainty that came with a family name, respected for 3 generations. Thomas Whitmore had built his import business from a single ship and 2 loyal contracts, and he had given his daughter every advantage that honest commerce could afford. And then Elias Mercer had taken it all apart, one loan at a time, so quietly that no one saw it happening until the walls were already bare. The debt notices lay in a pile on the writing table. The creditors had begun appearing at the back door last month. The servants, all but Ruth, had been let go in April. Her father had gone to Baltimore to meet with lawyers he could no longer afford, chasing a legal remedy that might never come. And Edward Bellamy had sent 9 sentences on cream paper and considered his obligation discharged. Clara walked to the window. The summer sun was indecently bright for a morning that felt this final. Boston moved below her carriages. Merchants, women with parasols, men with ledgers, none of them concerned with the fact that Clara Whitmore's life had just finished crumbling. "What do we do then?" Ruth asked. Clara didn't answer because she didn't know. She was still standing at that window 2 hours later when she heard the front door open. She had not heard a knock. She had not sent Ruth to answer anything. She turned from the window, already prepared to face another creditor, already rehearsing the composed expression she had learned to wear like a second dress over the past 3 months. The expression that said she was fine, that she was managing, that the situation was temporary, and everything was entirely under control. Nathaniel Ashford stepped into the parlor and removed his hat. How was not what she expected from the stories. Boston society described him in weather terms: cold front, frost warning, winter arriving early. They said he had never smiled at a social function. They said his shipping contracts were written in language that left no room for human error. They said his younger brother Samuel had been the warmth in the Ashford family, and that when Samuel died 2 years ago, Nathaniel had sealed himself behind his wealth, like a man barricading a door against something that might try to get back in. Looking at him now, Clara believed every word. He was tall, dark-coated, with the kind of composed face that gave away nothing. He looked at the bare walls, the cold fireplace, the debt notices on the table, and he did not flinch, did not look away with that particular polite discomfort she had learned to recognize in people who couldn't quite bear the sight of a ruined household. He simply took in the room the way a man might take in a business site before deciding whether to purchase it. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Ashford." She didn't move from where she stood. "I don't believe we have an appointment." "We don't." He set his hat on the chair nearest him, her father's reading chair which no one had sat in since March, and he looked at her directly. "I came because the matter I intend to discuss requires privacy, and because I did not believe you would agree to meet me in a public place." "The matter," she repeated. Yes, Clara waited. She was not going to make this easier for him by asking. Nathaniel Ashford reached into his coat, produced nothing, and simply stood in the middle of her ruined parlor, with his hands clasped behind his back, and said, "Miss Whitmore, I have come to ask you to marry me." The silence that followed was absolute. Ruth made a small sound from the doorway. Clara didn't look at her. She kept her eyes on Nathaniel's face, searching for the cruelty in it, the joke, the insult dressed as courtesy, the contempt that sometimes arrived wearing an expensive coat. She found none of it. His expression was serious, deliberate, and entirely without mockery. "You are not a man given to humor," she said carefully. "So I will ask you plainly, are you making sport of me?" "No." "Then you have lost your senses." "I have not." He moved to the writing table, not to touch the debt notices, but to stand near them, as if acknowledging them, without apology. "I am 35 years old. I have built the Ashford shipping operation into the largest private fleet in Massachusetts. I have a house that functions without warmth, a name that functions without reputation for kindness, and a life that functions without anyone in it who matters. I require a wife, not for society, not for comfort, for practical reasons that I am prepared to explain if you will hear them." Clara stared at him. "I know your situation completely," he continued. "Your father's debts are real and substantial. Mercer holds the Whitmore warehouse deed. Your former fiancé dissolved your engagement this morning by letter. You have one servant, one trunk of dresses, and no legal protection from whatever Mercer intends to do next. I am not telling you these things to humiliate you. I am telling you so that we are operating from the same set of facts. And from those facts," Clara said, "you have concluded that I am in a position to receive a marriage proposal. From those facts I have concluded that you need a husband, and I need a wife, and that you are the only woman in Boston I have met in the past 5 years who has not attempted to manage me." Something in her chest tightened, not softening, not warmth, just the particular sensation of being seen clearly for the first time in months. "What would you offer?" she asked. "My name. Legal protection from Mercer's collection process. Food warmth, staff safety. A household that functions. I will not restrict your movements, your correspondence, or your friendships. I will not embarrass you publicly, and I will not permit anyone else to do so either." "And what would you want in return?" He looked at her steadily. "A wife who expects nothing from my heart." There it was. Clear as water, cold as the fireplace grate beside her. Clara thought of Edward's 9 sentences. She thought of the creditors at the back door. She thought of her father's voice the last time they spoke, telling her he was sorry, that he was so sorry that he should have seen Mercer's game earlier, and he hadn't, and now everything they'd built was going to be taken apart, piece by piece, unless someone stopped it. She thought of what happened to women in her position, who refused the only offer available to them. "You will not pretend to love me," she said. "No. And I will not be required to pretend to love you." "Correct. But you will defend my name." Something shifted in his expression so briefly she might have imagined it. "Yes, without condition." Clara walked to the writing table. She looked at the debt notices for a long moment. Then she looked at Nathaniel Ashford. "I want Ruth included in the household," she said. "She comes with me, or I don't go." "Agreed. I want a private budget for correspondence with my father's lawyers, my own account not drawn through yours." He didn't hesitate. "Agreed. And I want one room in the house that is entirely mine, where I am not required to account for my time." "You may have any room you choose." Clara squared her shoulders. She did not extend her hand. She did not smile. She met his eyes with the same directness he had given her and said, "Then I will marry you, Mr. Ashford. Not because I am grateful, because it is the most rational decision available to me, and I intend to be honest about that." "That is all I am asking," he said. She nodded once. "You may go. I will be ready tomorrow at noon." He picked up his hat, walked to the door, paused. "Miss Whitmore." He did not turn around. "I am aware that this arrangement is not what you hoped for." "No," she said quietly. "It is not. For what it is worth," he said. And there was something careful in his voice now, something that did not belong to the composed businessman who had walked into her parlor 20 minutes ago. "I chose you because you answered the door yourself, because you had no servant to hide behind, and you didn't pretend otherwise. Most women in your position would have manufactured dignity. You simply had it." He walked out. Clara stood in the middle of the bare parlor for a long moment after the door closed. Then she turned to Ruth, who was staring at her with an expression caught somewhere between alarm and awe. "Start packing," Clara said. "Miss Clara. 1 trunk each, whatever matters most." She moved toward the staircase. "We leave tomorrow at noon." "Do you trust him?" Ruth asked. Clara stopped on the first step. She thought about the question honestly, not with the romantic impulse that had once told her to trust Edward Bellamy, but with the clear, cold logic of a woman who had just learned that hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. "I trust that he said what he meant," she said. "That's more than I can say for most men I've known." She climbed the stairs. Behind her, Ruth stood quietly for a moment, then moved to begin packing. Nathaniel's carriage arrived at 11:58. Clara was already standing at the front door when it pulled up. She wore a black dress not from mourning tradition, but because it was the most composed thing she owned, and she intended to walk out of this house looking like a woman who had made a decision, not a woman being collected from wreckage. Ruth stood behind her with both trunks. The house was locked. The debt notices were stacked neatly on the writing table for whoever came to claim them. Clara had left nothing that mattered. The carriage driver opened the door without a word. Ruth climbed in first. Clara stood on the top step and looked back at the house one final time. 4 years of courtship with Edward, conducted partly in that parlor. 12 years of dinners and music, and her father's stories about the ships, the contracts, the careful work of building something that lasted. Her own childhood pressed into the wallpaper, and the grain of the floorboards, and the particular way light came through the east window in the morning. She looked at it until she had it fully in her memory. Then she turned away and walked to the carriage. Nathaniel was already inside. He did not reach to help her in. He did not speak. He watched her settle into the seat across from him, with that same steady appraising stillness she had seen in the parlor, and he said nothing. The carriage began to move. Clara looked out the window as the Whitmore house on Beacon Hill disappeared behind them. She kept her face calm. She kept her hands folded in her lap. She did not let herself feel anything that she could not contain. "You are allowed to look back," Nathaniel said. She turned to him. "I already have." He studied her for a moment. Then he looked away toward his own window, toward whatever he carried behind his composed face that he had never offered to explain. The carriage rolled through Boston out of Beacon Hill and toward the road north, and Clara Whitmore, who was no longer entirely. Clara Whitmore rode toward the house of a man she did not know in a marriage built on terms she had negotiated for herself, with 1 trunk of dresses and enough pride to last her the rest of her life. The marriage had not begun with romance, but it had begun at least with honesty, and in the summer of 1816, in a city that had just finished destroying her honesty, felt like the most valuable thing anyone had offered her in years. The Ashford mansion did not welcome her. That was the first thing Clara understood when the carriage stopped and she stepped out onto the front drive. Not hostility, nothing so dramatic as that. Simply the particular atmosphere of a house that had been maintained without being loved. Every surface was clean. Every hinge worked. Every window glass was polished to a shine that reflected the summer sky without letting any of it inside. Ruth stepped up beside her and said nothing, which was Ruth's way of saying everything. A housekeeper named Mrs. Crane met them at the door, a woman of about 50, with the kind of efficient face that revealed exactly nothing about what she thought of her new mistress arriving with one trunk and a personal servant and a marriage that half of Boston was already talking about. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, and Clara noticed she did not stumble over it. "Mrs. Crane." Clara stepped inside without being ushered. "I would like to see the household accounts by end of day, if you please. All of them. Not a summary, the actual ledgers." Mrs. Crane blinked once. Mr. Ashford has agreed that I am to manage the domestic side of this household," Clara said, keeping her voice pleasant and absolutely final. "I would like to begin today." Mrs. Crane looked past Clara's shoulder, perhaps hoping for instruction from some higher authority. None arrived. Nathaniel had already gone to his study. The door was closed. "I'll have them brought to the sitting room," Mrs. Crane said. "Thank you," Clara said. "And please show Ruth to a room near mine." She walked into her new house with her back straight and her face composed, and she did not let herself feel anything until she found the small sitting room at the end of the east corridor, the one Mrs. Crane had indicated was hers, and closed the door behind her. Then she sat down in the nearest chair, pressed her hands flat against her knees, and gave herself exactly 60 seconds to feel the full weight of what she had done. 60 seconds. Then she straightened up, smoothed her dress, and waited for the ledgers. Nathaniel came to dinner at 7 o'clock precisely. He sat across from her at a table built for 12 in a room where two people eating at opposite ends felt less like a meal and more like two strangers waiting for a train. A servant placed soup before each of them. Another poured water. Then they withdrew, and the room was very quiet. Clara picked up her spoon. Nathaniel did the same. 3 minutes passed without a word spoken. Clara counted them. "The kitchen accounts are overspent by 11%, she said. Nathaniel looked up from his soup. "Mrs. Crane has been ordering provisions for a household of 12 when the actual staff is 7, Clara continued. "The difference is going somewhere, and I intend to find out where before the end of the week." He set his spoon down. "You reviewed the ledgers today. You agreed I could manage the domestic side." "I did." He studied her. "I didn't expect you to begin on the first afternoon." "What did you expect me to do?" He didn't answer immediately. That pause she was learning was not evasion. It was him actually considering the question instead of reaching for the nearest convenient answer. She noted that, filed it away. "I expected you would need time to settle," he said finally. "I settled," Clara said. "The ledgers helped. I work better when I have a problem in front of me." Something crossed his face, brief, unreadable. He picked up his spoon again. "Address the kitchen accounts as you see fit." "I intend to." She paused. "The east wing corridor is locked. 3 rooms." "Yes." "Are they storage?" "No." She waited. "They were my brother's," he said. "They remain closed." His voice did not change. That was the most telling thing about it, the complete deliberate absence of feeling in those 6 words. The way a man seals a wound, not by healing it, but by simply refusing to acknowledge it exists. Clara did not push. "Understood," she said, and went back to her soup. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he did too. Boston society arrived with its opinions before the first week was out. The invitations came first, cautious ones worded carefully enough to be plausibly innocent, if Clara declined, but pointed enough that she understood she was being tested. The wives of Nathaniel's business associates, curious and competitive, wanted to see what kind of woman had come out of the Whitmore wreckage and installed herself in the grandest house in the north end of the city. Clara accepted 3 of the invitations. She went to a Tuesday tea at the home of Mrs. Hargrove, a Thursday charitable meeting organized by the First Parish Ladies, and a Friday afternoon call at the home of a Mrs. Delaney, who was the acknowledged social center of the merchant class, and who Clara understood would form an opinion that the other 24 women in Boston would simply adopt as their own. She wore her plainest dress to each one. She spoke when asked. She listened more than she spoke. At the tea, a woman named Mrs. Alderton said, while looking at the window, "Of course it is very fortunate for some women that wealthy men develop charitable impulses." The room paused almost imperceptibly, that collective held breath that meant everyone had heard and everyone was waiting. Clara set her teacup down. "Mr. Ashford has never struck me as a man of charitable impulse," she said pleasantly. "He is a man of practical logic. I suspect he married me for the same reason he builds his ships the way he does, because he recognized quality of material when he saw it." One or two women looked away to hide their expressions. Mrs. Alderton's smile went fixed. Clara picked her teacup back up and turned the conversation to the price of Sea Island cotton, which she had learned from her father's ledgers, and which she knew 3 times more about than anyone else in the room. She came home from each visit with exactly the information she needed: who was genuinely curious, who was hostile, who was waiting to see which way the wind blew before committing to an opinion. She wrote none of it down. She kept it in the organized filing system of her own mind, which had always been sharper than people expected, and she planned accordingly. Nathaniel was in the front hall when she returned from Mrs. Delaney's on Friday afternoon. He had a letter in his hand and was reading it standing up, which she had already identified as something he did when the contents required immediate attention. "How was the call?" he asked without looking up. "Useful," Clara said. "Mrs. Delaney will be civil, which means her circle will be civil. Mrs. Alderton will not, which means I should expect that particular kind of trouble from her direction." He looked up from the letter. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that comes through insinuation and carefully placed conversation. Nothing I can't manage." She removed her gloves. "She implied I married you because you felt sorry for me." "What did you say?" "That you married me because you recognized quality of material." She glanced at him. "I hope that was not too presumptuous." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, perhaps. The look of a man encountering something he didn't expect and finding it unexpectedly correct. "No," he said. "That was not presumptuous." He went back to his letter. Clara went upstairs to change for dinner. She did not let herself feel pleased about that, but she noticed she felt it anyway. The first real fracture happened on a Wednesday. Clara had been working through the East Wing, not the locked rooms, which she had promised herself to leave alone, but the rooms adjacent to them, the ones that had been shut and sheeted since Samuel's death, and simply never reopened. She was not renovating. She was not rearranging. She was simply removing the dust covers and opening the windows because a house with sealed rooms bred a particular kind of despair that seeped through the walls into every other space, and she knew it from experience. She did not expect Nathaniel to be home. He came up the back staircase. She heard his boots on the wood and stopped in the doorway of the first room she'd opened, which had been a reading room of some kind. Bookshelves, 2 armchairs, a writing table near the window. Small personal nothing like the formal rooms downstairs. Clara had the dust cover half folded in her arms when she heard him stop. She turned around. The look on his face was something she had not seen from him before. It was not anger. It was not the composed blankness he wore in public, or the careful, measured attention he gave her at dinner. It was something rawer than that, something that hadn't had time to get its defenses up. "I told Mrs. Crane these rooms were to remain closed," he said. His voice was even, but his hands, she noticed, were held very still at his sides, the way a man holds still when stillness is the only control he has left. "You told Mrs. Crane," Clara said. "You did not tell me. I assumed it was understood. Then we should have been clearer with each other." She set the dust cover down over the nearest chair. "I'm not trying to erase anything, Mr. Ashford. I'm trying to stop the house from feeling like a mausoleum. That is not your decision to make. In the rooms you gave me full management of it is. These rooms—" He stopped, started again. "These rooms are not part of that agreement." Clara looked at him steadily. She understood in that moment that she was not simply fighting about a dust cover. She was standing at the edge of something much deeper. The locked place where Samuel lived inside Nathaniel. The place he had built walls around so high and thick he'd almost managed to forget there was something on the other side of them. She could push. She could be right. She could win the argument on pure logic and leave him standing alone in the doorway of a room that still smelled like his brother. She chose not to. "You're right," she said. I should have asked first. I apologize for that. He looked at her. The rawness in his face shifted, not gone but recalibrated. I'll leave the rest of the east wing covered, she said. But the windows stay open in this room. Sealed air does nothing good for the wood, and your brother's books deserve better than to sit in the damp. She walked past him to the door, stopped just short of the hallway. When you're ready to tell me about him, she said quietly. I'll listen. I won't ask again before then. She went back downstairs and did not look to see if he watched her go. The whisper campaign started with Edward. Clara learned about it from Ruth, who learned it from the grocer's boy, who had heard it from someone in the employ of the Bellamy household. Edward was telling people quietly in the kinds of conversations that happened at the edges of gentlemen's clubs, and after the third glass of brandy, that the Whitmore debts were not entirely Thomas Whitmore's fault. That there had been irregularities. That Clara had been aware of certain financial arrangements her father made and had chosen to overlook them for her own benefit. It was not a direct accusation. It was the kind of thing that didn't need to be direct to do its damage. A question planted here. A hesitation there. A man saying, I'm not saying she knew, in a tone that said precisely the opposite. When Ruth told her, Clara sat very still for a moment. Then she said, How many people have heard it? Enough, Ruth said. The merchant wives will have it by end of week. Clara stood up. Where is Mr. Ashford? In his study, ma'am. He has Mr. Graves with him, the solicitor. Good. She crossed to the study door and knocked twice briskly. Not waiting. She was not in the mood to wait. Nathaniel's voice from inside. One moment. She opened the door anyway. Both men looked at her. Mr. Graves, the solicitor, had the expression of a man who was deciding very rapidly what to make of her. Nathaniel had the expression of a man who was startled, but concealing it. Forgive me, Clara said, looking at Graves. I need 1 minute with my husband. Graves gathered his papers with admirable efficiency and stepped into the hallway. Clara closed the door. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Ashford, Edward is spreading a story, she said. He's implying I had knowledge of my father's financial irregularities before the debt became public. He's being careful enough that no one can accuse him of lying outright. It will reach the merchant wives by Friday and your business associates by the following week. Nathaniel said nothing. He looked at her with that steady, measuring attention he brought to everything. I need to know 2 things, Clara said. First, do you believe him? The pause before he answered was so brief it almost wasn't there. No. Something in her chest loosened. She hadn't known she was holding it until it went. Second, she said, do you have a solicitor capable of sending a very pointed letter to the Bellamy household? One that does not threaten anything explicitly, but makes the cost of continuing this story absolutely clear. Nathaniel looked at the door Graves had just gone through. He's standing in the hallway. Then let's not waste his time, Clara said, and went to open the door. Graves came back in with the look of a man who had already guessed what was wanted and was quietly deciding he liked this woman. Nathaniel watched Clara sit down across from his solicitor and begin laying out the specifics of Edward's whispering campaign with the precise, organized clarity of someone who had been thinking several steps ahead since before she came through the door. For the first time since she'd arrived in his house, Nathaniel Ashford did not know what to say. So he said nothing, and he watched his wife dismantle Edward Bellamy's strategy with the same calm efficiency with which she had identified the kitchen account discrepancy on her first afternoon. When Graves left 20 minutes later with clear instructions and a retainer fee that Nathaniel signed without flinching, Clara smoothed her dress and turned toward the door. Miss Whitmore, Nathaniel said. She turned back, waited. He caught himself. Mrs. Ashford, he corrected quietly, and she understood it was not a mistake. It was something else, a recognition of the name she had traded her old life for, spoken the way a man speaks something he's still learning the weight of. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, his hands flat on the desk, something working behind his composed face that hadn't worked its way into language yet. He should not have done that to you, Nathaniel said finally. Bellamy, any of it. Clara held his gaze. No, she said. He shouldn't have. She went out. In the hallway, she walked slowly enough that her steps were steady and her face was clear before she reached the main corridor, where Mrs. Crane was directing a servant with a polished tray. She nodded to them both. She went upstairs. In her room, she sat at the small desk by the window that she had made her own particular corner of this house, and she wrote a letter to her father in Baltimore. "I am well," she wrote. "The house is large and somewhat cold, but I am addressing that. I believe we are going to be all right." She stopped there. Considered whether that was true. Decided that it was not untrue, which in the summer of 1816 felt like enough to work with. She sealed the letter and set it out for the morning post and went to join Nathaniel for dinner, where they sat at the long table for 12 and talked about the kitchen accounts and the Graves matter, and for the first time without either of them quite planning it. Something that was almost nearly cautiously beginning to feel like a real conversation. The letter from Graves arrived at the Bellamy household on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon, Edward had stopped talking. Clara knew because Ruth knew, and Ruth knew because the grocer's boy knew, and that particular network of information had proven itself more reliable than any formal intelligence Nathaniel's solicitors could have assembled. The whisper campaign went quiet. Not an apology. Edward was not a man built for apology, but silence, which in Boston society functioned as the next best thing. Nathaniel said nothing about it at dinner that evening. But when he passed her in the front hallway that afternoon, he paused and said, "Graves reported success," in the tone of a man delivering a business update, and Clara said, "Good," in the tone of a woman who had expected nothing less, and that was the entire exchange. It shouldn't have felt like something. It felt like something anyway. What she had not expected, what she was only now beginning to understand, was that winning small battles inside the Ashford house was not the same as winning the war that Boston society had quietly declared on her. Edward's silence removed one weapon. It did not remove the army. The real offensive began at the Hargrove Assembly. It was the largest social gathering of the summer season, held at the Hargrove estate on a Saturday evening in late July. Every merchant family of consequence in Boston attended. Every shipping partner Nathaniel had. Every wife who had been watching Clara since her arrival at the Ashford house, with the careful, predatory attention of women who understood that social position was a finite resource, and a newcomer's gain was someone else's loss. Clara wore a deep green dress, the finest one she owned, the one her mother had commissioned years ago for a dinner that never happened, because her mother had died the winter before it was scheduled. She had never worn it. She wore it now because it was the best she had, and she had decided weeks ago that she was done performing poverty as a form of apology. Nathaniel looked at her when she came down the stairs. He didn't say anything. But he offered his arm, and the way he did it, not perfunctorily, not the contractual gesture of a man fulfilling an arrangement, but with a kind of deliberate steadiness, like a man planting his feet before a storm, told her he understood what this evening was. "They will watch everything," she said quietly, as they moved toward the door. "They always do," he said. "If something happens tonight, nothing will happen tonight that we cannot manage." She almost said, "You don't know that." She looked at his face instead, at the composed certainty there, and decided to borrow it for the evening. She would return it later if she needed to. They arrived at the Hargrove estate to a room already full and already watching. The first hour was almost pleasant. Clara moved through the assembly with the controlled ease she had spent the past weeks building, greeting the women who were willing to be greeted, engaging the husbands who asked about shipping and finding. She knew more than they expected, deflecting the probing questions about her father's situation with answers so smooth and informed that the questioners had nothing to push against. Nathaniel stayed near her, not hovering but present. When men addressed him over her head, the particular social habit of speaking to the husband, as if the wife were merely furniture, with good posture, she answered before he could. He let her. That, she realized, was its own kind of statement. Mrs. Alderton found her at the edge of the refreshment table. "Mrs. Ashford." The woman's smile was the kind that arrived fully assembled without warmth as a component. "How well you look. Green is a courageous color for a woman in your position." "Is it?" Clara said. "I've always thought courage was more of an action than a color." "Of course." Mrs. Alderton glanced across the room to where Nathaniel was speaking with two other men. "He keeps close watch on you this evening." "We are newly married," Clara said. "I imagine he finds me interesting. Some might say protective." "Some might," Clara agreed. "Others might call it partnership. It depends on what you're used to, I suppose." Mrs. Alderton's smile did not change, but something behind her eyes sharpened, and Clara understood that the pleasantries portion of this particular exchange was finished. Then she heard it, not loudly. The room was not the kind of place where damage was done loudly. It came in the measured carrying voice of Elias Mercer, who was standing 12 feet away, with 3 men, Clara recognized as harbor board members, saying, "The Whitmore girl always had a talent for selective memory. Convenient not to notice what your father's doing when noticing might have cost you your supper." The 3 men shifted. One laughed quietly. The others wore the expressions of people watching something they were not going to stop. Clara went very still. Across the room, Nathaniel had not heard it. He was still in conversation, his back half turned. Mercer continued, unhurried the way a man speaks when he's confident no one will interrupt him. "The real question is whether Ashford knows what he actually married. A ruined name is one thing. A family that participated in its own ruin is another matter entirely." The room did not go silent. It went careful. That specific charged attentiveness of a crowd that was hearing something and deciding collectively whether to pretend it hadn't. Clara set down her glass. Ruth had once told her when she was 12 years old and had come home crying after a girl at the parish school said something vicious about her dress. The only way to answer a liar in public is to make the truth louder than the lie. And you do it without shaking. Clara walked across the room. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She moved with the particular deliberate calm of a woman who had made her decision 3 steps ago and was simply carrying it out. People moved aside whether they meant to or not, because there was something in her bearing that made standing in her path feel inadvisable. She stopped in front of Mercer. He turned, and for 1/2 second, she saw genuine surprise on his face. The expression of a man who had calculated that she was too fragile, too socially precarious, too aware of her position, to confront him directly in a room full of people who already had opinions about her. He had miscalculated. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was clear and even and entirely without performance. She was not being dramatic. She was simply being heard. "I believe you've been speaking about my family." The men around him said nothing. The room around her had gone to that particular quality of silence. Mercer recovered quickly. He was a man who had spent decades making money from other people's disasters and had learned to wear confidence like armor. "Mrs. Ashford, I was simply making an observation among friends." "You were making an accusation," Clara said. "You implied that I had knowledge of my father's debt structure before it became public. I want to be precise about that because precision matters when we're discussing a man's character." She paused. "Or a woman's." "My dear, I am not your dear." She said it without heat, simply as a correction of fact. "I am Mrs. Nathaniel Ashford and I have spent the past 6 weeks reviewing my father's financial records in full. Every ledger, every loan document, every letter of credit." She reached into the small bag at her wrist. Ruth had known somehow that she might need it and produced a folded document. Including the loan modification Mercer and Sons made to the Whitmore account in March of 1814, which extended the principal at 3 times the original interest rate without proper written notification to my father, in direct violation of the terms of the original agreement. The room did not move. Mercer's face changed. "That is a copy," Clara said. "The original is with our solicitors, along with the deed transfer documents for the Whitmore warehouse, which were filed 4 days before my father signed the debt. Acknowledgement, meaning the deed was claimed before the debt was legally established." She folded the paper and replaced it in her bag. "You did not ruin my father because he was careless, Mr. Mercer. You ruined him because you needed that warehouse and he wouldn't sell it." The silence in the room was absolute now. One of the harbor board members cleared his throat. Another had taken a half step back from Mercer without appearing to notice he'd done it. Mercer's voice, when it came, had lost its carrying quality. "These are serious allegations, Mrs. Ashford." "Yes," she said. "They are. I suggest you speak with your own solicitors before the week is out." She turned deliberately and completely away from him, the particular social dismissal of turning your back on a man still speaking, and found that Nathaniel was standing 6 feet behind her. She didn't know when he'd crossed the room. He was simply there as he had been in the east wing doorway, as he had been at the front hall. The morning the Bellamy letter arrived, present at the precise moment when his presence changed the geometry of the situation. Howe was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. She couldn't name it immediately. It was not admiration exactly. It was the look of a man encountering something that had just fundamentally revised one of his long-held conclusions. He stepped forward and placed himself beside her. Not in front. Beside, and in a voice that carried, because he understood, as she did, that the room was still listening. He said, "She is not under my protection because she is weak. She is my equal because she had the courage to stand when every coward in this room wanted her to kneel." Someone near the back of the room made a small sound. The crowd shifted and resettled the way crowds do when the weight of collective opinion changes direction. Mercer said nothing. Edward Bellamy, who had been standing near the fireplace and had witnessed all of it, went very quietly to retrieve his coat. They left the assembly an hour later. Not fleeing. Clara was precise about that. They stayed long enough that leaving was a choice, not a retreat. They spoke with 3 more sets of guests. They accepted congratulations from Mrs. Delaney, who was experienced enough to recognize a social turning point when she witnessed one, and wise enough to position herself on the correct side of it without delay. In the carriage home, they sat in silence for several minutes. It was a different silence than the one on their wedding day. That silence had been the careful quiet of 2 strangers avoiding collision. This one had weight to it. History. "You had those documents ready," Nathaniel said. "I've had them for 2 weeks, Clara said. "I was waiting to see if I'd need them." "You knew Mercer would move against you." "I knew someone would. He was the most likely." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you I had them. I should have." "Why didn't you?" She considered the question honestly. "Because I needed to know I could do it myself. That if I had to stand in that room alone, I had what I needed." She paused. "I wasn't sure you'd be there." The carriage moved through the dark summer street. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. "I was always going to be there," he said. "I know that now." Another silence. "What you said," Clara started. "In front of everyone. About me being your equal. It is true. Men say things in public that they don't always carry home with them." "I know," he said. "I have met those men. I am not one of them." She looked at him, then really looked the way she had been careful not to for weeks, because looking too directly at a man you were not supposed to be feeling anything for was a particular kind of danger she had been managing carefully since the first dinner. I was looking back at her with that same steady attention, and for once there was nothing composed about it, nothing strategic or measured. He was simply a man who was tired of his own defenses and was not in that particular moment bothering to hide it. "Nathan," she said. "Not Mr. Ashford. His name." Something moved across his face. "Did you mean it?" she asked. "What you said about me? Not for the room, for yourself." The carriage slowed outside the Ashford house. The driver opened the door. Neither of them moved. "Yes," Nathaniel said. Clara held his gaze for one more moment. Then she stepped out of the carriage and walked into the house and climbed the stairs to her room and sat at her desk with her hands pressed flat against the wood, and understood that something had shifted tonight that she could not shift back and was not entirely certain she wanted to. She did not write to her father that night. She sat for a long time in the quiet, listening to the house breathe around her, warmer than it had been, fuller, more alive. And she thought about a man who had stood beside her when he didn't have to, and called her his equal when it cost him something to do it, and looked at her in a moving carriage as though she had just become the most surprising and consequential discovery of his entire life. She thought about Samuel's locked rooms. She thought about a marriage built on terms, and how terms could be renegotiated, and how that process, the careful, honest renegotiation of a contract between 2 people who had each lost something and were each still standing, was maybe not so different from love after all. She didn't sleep for a long time. And across the house in his study, with the lamp burning low over a desk covered in shipping contracts he had not looked at since sitting down, Nathaniel Ashford was not sleeping either. He came to find her the next morning. Not at breakfast. She had taken hers early in her room, needing the quiet before she faced whatever the day after the Hargrove assembly would require. Not in the east corridor where she had resumed the careful work of making the house feel less like a monument. He found her in the small garden off the south side of the house where she had gone, because the summer morning was clean, and she needed air that hadn't been breathed by anyone else for a few minutes. She heard his boots on the path, and didn't turn around. "I owe you an explanation," Nathaniel said. "You don't owe me anything," Clara said. "We negotiated the terms clearly." The terms did not account for last night. She turned then. He was standing with his hands at his sides, no coat, no hat, the least composed she had ever seen him look in daylight, which on Nathaniel Ashford meant that only about 70% of his defenses were in place instead of the full 100. "Sit down," she said, because there was a bench, and he looked like a man who needed one. He sat. She stayed standing, which was not a power decision. She simply thought better on her feet. "Tell me about Samuel," she said. He looked up at her. "You said you'd tell me when you were ready," she reminded him. "I'm asking if you're ready." Howe was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to say no. Then he said, "Samuel was 26 when he died. Fever. It came fast, 4 days from the first sign to the end." He said it the way he said most things, evenly and without ornamentation, but his hands on his knees were pressed flat in the way she had learned meant he was holding something down. "He sent me a letter when he first fell sick. I was in Portsmouth. A contract negotiation I had been building for 8 months. I told myself he was young, that he was strong, that the doctors would manage it." "But you knew," Clara said quietly. "I knew." He looked at his hands. "I arrived home on the 5th day. Mrs. Crane met me at the door." He stopped. "That was 2 years ago. I have not been in Samuel's rooms since the week after his funeral." Clara sat down beside him. Not close, the appropriate distance for two people having a conversation that mattered. "What was he like?" Nathaniel made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Exactly the opposite of me. He laughed at everything. He brought people into the house. Musicians, painters, the most impractical collection of friends you can imagine. The servants adored him." A pause. "I told him once that he was too free with his trust, that people would take advantage of his openness." He stopped again. "He told me I was too free with my suspicion, that I would spend my whole life guarding against loss and end up with nothing worth guarding." The garden was quiet around them. Somewhere in the distance a horse moved on the street. "He was right," Nathaniel said. "I did not like that he was right." "You've been punishing yourself for 2 years," Clara said. It was not an accusation. It was simply the truth of it, plainly stated. "I sealed the house, the rooms, everything that reminded me." He looked at her directly. "And then I walked into your parlor on Beacon Hill and saw a woman standing in a ruined house with her back straight and her face composed, and I thought—" He stopped. "What did you think?" she asked. "That you were the only person I had met in 2 years who looked like you understood loss without being destroyed by it." He said it simply, without drama. "I thought if I brought you into this house, some of that would remain." He caught himself. "I am aware that is not a sufficient reason to marry someone." "No," Clara agreed. "It isn't." She looked at him steadily. "But it is a human one." He was quiet. "Nathan." She used his name again deliberately. "What you did last night standing beside me, saying what you said. I meant it. I know you did. That's what I want to talk about." She folded her hands in her lap. "Our arrangement was specific. You said you wanted a wife who expected nothing from your heart. I agreed to that because I didn't have a choice, and because I thought I could manage it." She paused. "I am finding that I cannot manage it as well as I anticipated." The silence between them changed. He looked at her with that particular attention, the one that wasn't appraising anymore, wasn't measuring, was simply present in a way that made the air between them feel different. "What are you telling me?" he asked. "I'm telling you," Clara said carefully, "that the terms need renegotiating, and I'm asking whether you are willing to do that." Honestly. Not because of Samuel, and not because I defended myself at the Hargrove Assembly, and not because it is convenient. She met his eyes. Because you want to. He didn't answer immediately. She had learned to read his pauses. This one was not evasion. It was a man taking apart a wall he had spent 2 years building and trying to determine brick by brick whether he could afford to set it down. I don't know how to do this, he said finally. I want to be honest with you about that. I have been managing this house and this business and this life without needing to consider another person for so long that I am genuinely uncertain how to proceed. I know, she said. I'm not asking for certainty. I'm asking for willingness. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. I am willing. Clara nodded once. She stood up. Then start by opening Samuel's music room this afternoon. Not for me, for yourself. She went back inside, and she did not look back to see if he followed her instruction. He opened the music room at 3 o'clock. The legal case against Mercer took shape the following week with a speed that surprised even Graves. It turned out Clara was not the only one who had been keeping records. She had begun quietly over the past month making inquiries through Ruth, through the grocer's boy, through the network of small merchants and harbor workers who existed in the spaces between the grand financial offices of Boston, invisible to men like Mercer, precisely because he had never considered them worth noticing. She had asked Ruth to ask around, were there others? Other small merchants who had taken loans from Mercer and Sons and found the terms changed without notice. Other warehouse owners who had been pushed to the edge of insolvency just before Mercer made a purchasing offer. The answer came back in 4 voices, then 6, then 9. A widow named Mrs. Hooper, whose husband's cooperage had been forced into sale 18 months ago. A small grain merchant named Aldous Webb, who had been paying an interest rate he had not agreed to for 2 years before he finally gave up and signed the warehouse deed. A harbor clerk named Foster, who had personally witnessed Mercer's agent altering loan documents and had said nothing because he needed his position and had a family to feed. Clara brought them all to Graves. She did it methodically, carefully, without drama. She simply appeared in Graves's office one Tuesday morning with Mrs. Hooper and Mr. Webb and a folder of corroborating documents, and she sat across from the solicitor and said, "This is not an isolated case. This is a pattern. I want to know what can be done with a pattern." Graves looked at the documents, looked at the 2 witnesses, looked at Clara. "A great deal," he said. Nathaniel arrived at the office 20 minutes later because Clara had sent Ruth with a note asking him to come. He walked in, took in the situation in approximately 4 seconds, and sat down beside his wife without being asked and said, "Tell me what you need from me." Graves told him. What Mercer had done was not simply predatory lending. The deed transfer fraud, the loan modification without notification, the falsified interest structures combined with the testimonies of Webb and Mrs. Hooper, and the documentary evidence of Foster's witnessed alterations. It was a case of deliberate financial fraud extending over at least 6 years. The Harbor Board connection Mercer had cultivated meant the fraud had been protected from above. Bringing it required either a private legal action, expensive, slow, uncertain, or enough public documentation to make Mercer's Harbor Board allies unwilling to defend him. "We do both," Clara said. Nathaniel looked at her. "We file the private action through Graves, and we give the documented evidence to the Boston Courier. Not all of it. Enough." She looked at Graves. "How long for the legal filing?" 2 weeks to prepare properly. Then we give the Courier the story in 3 weeks, after the filing is public record." Graves nodded slowly. "That is a sound sequence." Nathaniel said nothing for a moment. Then, "The Harbor Board will retaliate. Mercer has friends there who will come after Ashford shipping contracts." "I know," Clara said. "That could cost us significantly." "I know that too." She met his eyes. "Is that a reason to stop?" He held her gaze. Something settled in his face, the last of whatever had been hesitating. "No," he said. "It is not." The twist came from a direction Clara had not anticipated. It was Foster, the harbor clerk, who told her. He appeared at the Ashford house on a Thursday evening, nervous and sweating, asking for Mrs. Ashford specifically, and refusing to speak with anyone else until she came to the front sitting room. Clara came down alone. Foster was a thin man in his 40s, the kind of man who had spent decades being carefully invisible and had the particular anxious energy of someone who had just made a decision that terrified him. He twisted his hat in his hands and didn't sit even when she indicated the chair. "Ma'am," he said, "I need to tell you something I didn't tell the solicitor." "All right," Clara said. "Tell me." "Bellamy," he said. "Mr. Edward Bellamy. He knew about the Whitmore warehouse deal before your father signed anything. He and Mercer had an agreement. Bellamy was going to get a 20% share of the warehouse proceeds once the deed transferred in exchange for staying quiet about the loan manipulation." He swallowed. "He didn't leave you because of the debts, ma'am. He left you because the deal was almost done, and he couldn't afford to be attached to a Whitmore when it went through." Clara was very still. She had known in a general way that Edward was a coward. She had known he was mercenary. She had not let herself know that his abandonment had been a calculated financial decision. That those 9 sentences on cream paper had been written by a man who had already sold her. "How do you know this?" she asked. Her voice was even. She was proud of it. "I was there when they discussed it." Foster's jaw worked. "Mercer's office. November of last year. I brought papers for Mercer to sign, and they didn't hear me come in. I heard enough." He looked at his hat. "I should have said something sooner. I know that. I was afraid of losing my position." "You're saying something now," Clara said. He looked up. "That matters," she said. "Are you willing to tell the solicitor?" "That's why I came," he said quietly. Clara stood. "Wait here." She went to the study, knocked twice, opened the door. Nathaniel looked up. She said simply, "Come downstairs. You need to hear this." He heard it. His face went very still in the way it did when he was managing something significant. And when Foster finished speaking, Nathaniel looked at Clara with an expression that asked without words whether she was all right. She gave him one precise nod that said she was. After Foster left with instructions to present himself at Graves's office the following morning, the front hall was quiet. Ruth had tactfully disappeared. The evening light was going soft through the windows. "He sold you," Nathaniel said, not as a question, as an acknowledgement of something brutal. "Yes," Clara said. "Are you?" "I am angry," she said clearly, and without apology. "I was going to marry that man. I built 4 years around him, and the entire time he was calculating the profit margin on my family's disaster." She pressed her hands flat against her sides. "I am furious, and I am glad I know, and I am done discussing Edward Bellamy for the rest of my natural life." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said with a directness that matched hers, "Good. He is not worth another moment of your attention." "No," she said. "He isn't." She moved toward the stairs, stopped. "Nathan." She turned back. "The thing you said, that you don't know how to do this. How to be in a marriage that requires you to consider another person." He waited. "You've been doing it," she said. "Since Foster knocked on the door tonight, you've been watching my face, not the problem my face, to see if I was all right." She looked at him steadily. "That is what it looks like. That's all it is." He stood in the middle of the front hall, with no composure left to hide behind, and he looked at her with the specific, helpless clarity of a man who had just understood something that he could not unfeel. "Clara," he said, just her name, nothing after it. But the way he said it, like it was something he was learning to hold carefully because it mattered, told her everything the rest of the sentence would have contained. "Good night, Nathan," she said. She went upstairs. Behind her, she heard him go back to his study, and through the ceiling, she could hear him not working, the particular silence of someone sitting at a desk with papers in front of them that they are not reading, thinking instead about something that has just changed the entire shape of the room they are sitting in. The next morning she came down to breakfast and found Samuel's music room open, the sheet music on the stand rearranged, and a single fresh flower in the vase on the windowsill. She did not ask who had put it there. She sat down at the breakfast table and waited. And when Nathaniel came in and sat across from her and looked at her with the face of a man who has spent the night tearing down the most fortified room inside himself and is still standing, she poured his coffee and said, "Graves needs us at 11. We have a case to finish building." "Yes," he said. And they ate breakfast together in a house that had learned slowly and without ceremony to feel like home. Graves filed the legal action against Elias Mercer on a Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon, all of Boston knew, not because anyone from the Ashford household said a word. Because Mercer's own solicitor, upon receiving the formal notice of complaint, went directly to the Harbor Board offices to warn his client's allies. And Harbor Board offices, as Clara had already learned, were the single least confidential spaces in the city. 3 men heard, 6 men talked. By the time the evening papers were being set, the story was already moving through Boston on its own momentum-gathering detail and velocity, the way stories did when they contained enough truth to be irresistible. Clara was in the front sitting room when Ruth brought her the early copy of the Boston Courier that the printer's boy had delivered. Not the full story yet, that would come in 2 weeks as planned, but a brief notice in the commercial column. Legal proceedings commenced against Mercer and Sons merchant lenders regarding alleged fraud in loan documentation and unauthorized deed transfers. Multiple complainants named. She read it twice, set it down, picked up her tea. Ruth was watching her from the doorway. "Well," she said. "It's begun," Clara said. Ruth let out a long breath that contained about 3 months of held anxiety. "And Mercer? We'll fight it," Clara said. "He has money and connections, and he has been doing this long enough to have a strategy ready. This is not over." She looked at Ruth steadily. "But it has started, and it has started on our terms. That matters." Nathaniel came in from the hallway with his coat still on. He had been at the shipping office, she knew, managing the first wave of the Harbor Board's quiet displeasure, which had arrived in the form of 2 postponed contract renewals, and 1 very cool letter from a man who had been a business associate for 11 years. He set the letter on the side table without comment and sat down across from her. "Hensley pulled his spring contract," he said. "I know. Graves told me. That's $1,200. "I know that too." She met his eyes. "Are you telling me you want to stop?" He looked at her for a moment. Then the ghost of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but the structural equivalent of one. "No," he said. "I'm telling you the cost, so we're operating from the same facts. That's what you said to me, first conversation we ever had." She remembered. The bare parlor, the debt notices. "I am telling you so that we are operating from the same set of facts." "So we are," she said. He nodded. He picked up the courier notice, read it, set it down again. "Graves says Mercer will try to settle privately before it reaches the Harbor Board hearing. He'll offer money. Most likely." "We won't take it," Clara said. "No." Nathaniel agreed. "We won't." Mercer's private offer arrived on Wednesday, delivered by his solicitor to Graves's office in the form of a sealed letter containing a figure that was by any reasonable measure substantial. Graves sent a messenger to the Ashford house with the amount written on a single piece of paper, no commentary. Clara read it, passed it to Nathaniel. He read it, passed it back. "No," he said. "Write that back." Clara told Graves's messenger. In precisely that word. The messenger blinked. Just no," she said. "Mr. Graves will understand." The offer was declined by end of day. The following morning, Mercer made his second move, the one Clara had been expecting and had been quietly preparing for since Foster's visit. He went to the newspapers. Not the Courier, which he had correctly assessed as already unfriendly territory, but a smaller commercial sheet called the Harbor Register, which had published favorable coverage of his business interests for the past decade, and owed him enough in goodwill to run a story, suggesting that the legal complaint against Mercer and Sons was motivated not by genuine fraud, but by personal grievance, specifically the grievance of a woman whose family had defaulted on legitimate loans and who had married above her station and was now using her husband's influence to rewrite history. The story ran Thursday morning. Clara read it at breakfast. She finished her coffee. She set the paper down and said to no one in particular, "He used my marriage against me." Nathaniel looked at her across the table. His jaw was tight. "He thinks calling you a social climber undermines the legal case," she said. "He thinks if he makes this about my character, The harbor board allies will have justification to dismiss the complaint. She was thinking aloud now, working it through. He's wrong about the law, but he's not entirely wrong about the board. What do you want to do? Nathaniel asked. She looked at him. I want to call Mrs. Hooper and Mr. Webb. The witnesses, and Foster. I want all three of them willing to speak publicly, not just to Graves, to the courier, their names, their stories, their documents, all of it. She paused. Mercer can call me a social climber. He cannot call a widow whose cooperage he stole a social climber. He cannot call a harbor clerk with 8 years of witnessed documents a social climber. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. That puts them at risk. He'll go after their livelihoods. I know. She had thought about this. She had thought about it since Tuesday. That's why I want to speak with them myself before we ask. Not Graves. Me. They deserve to hear what it may cost them from someone who has already paid that cost. He looked at her with the expression she had learned over the past months to recognize as the one he wore when she had done something that revised his understanding of her. Which happened, she had noticed, with a frequency that suggested his initial understanding had been significantly underestimated. All right, he said. I'll arrange the carriage. I don't need you to come, she said. I know, he said. I'm coming anyway. Mrs. Hooper agreed without hesitation. She was a small woman in her late 50s who had been running a boarding house since her husband's cooperage was taken, and she received Clara and Nathaniel in her front sitting room with the particular dignity of someone who has been surviving with insufficient resources for long enough that dignity has become the one thing she absolutely refuses to surrender. Clara told her clearly what public testimony would require, what it might cost, that Mercer would likely retaliate through whatever channels remained to him, that there were no guarantees the case would resolve in their favor, though the legal foundation was strong. Mrs. Hooper listened to all of it. Then she said, Mrs. Ashford, that man took everything my husband built in 30 years and filed it under a debt my husband did not legally owe. I have been waiting 18 months for someone with enough resources to fight back. She folded her hands in her lap. I will be in Graves's office Monday morning. Mr. Webb said yes by letter received Friday. Foster took longer. He came to the Ashford house Saturday afternoon and sat in the front sitting room with his hat in his hands again, and Clara sat across from him and waited. If I speak publicly, Foster said, Mercer will make sure I never work a harbor position again. Yes, Clara said. Probably. I have 3 children. I know. She did not offer false comfort. She had promised herself she wouldn't. Mr. Ashford's shipping operation has need of a harbor administrator with 8 years of documented experience. That position would not be subject to Mercer's influence. She paused. I am not offering you a bribe. I am offering you an alternative livelihood in the event that Mercer does exactly what you're afraid he'll do. The offer stands regardless of whether you speak publicly. Foster looked at her, looked at Nathaniel, who had said nothing, and simply sat in the chair beside Clara. With the steady anchoring presence, he had developed the habit of providing in rooms where things that mattered were being decided. You'd do that regardless, Foster said. Yes, Clara said simply. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I'll speak. The Harbor Board hearing was scheduled for the second week of August, and in the 10 days before it, Boston arranged itself into positions. The Courier ran the full story. The Monday before the hearing. 3 columns front commercial page naming Mercer and Sons directly, and including excerpts from the loan modification documents, the deed transfer timeline, and a statement from Mrs. Hooper that was in Clara's assessment, the single most devastating piece of evidence in the entire case, because it was written in the plain language of a woman describing the loss of something real, and no one reading it could mistake it for anything other than exactly what it was. The Harbor Board allies went quiet. Not supportive quiet. The distinction mattered. Quiet meant they were calculating, which meant they were uncertain, which meant the outcome was no longer predetermined. Edward Bellamy left Boston the Thursday before the hearing. Clara heard about it from Ruth, who heard it from the grocer's boy. He told no one where he was going. He simply closed his house and went. She felt nothing about it. That absence of feeling was itself a kind of resolution, The recognition that a man she had spent 4 years building her future around had been hollowed out the whole time, and the grief she'd carried since June was not for him, but for the version of him she had invented, which had never existed to begin with. She told Nathaniel that evening. They were in the sitting room. Her sitting room, the one she had made her own that first afternoon. But it had become gradually, and without announcement, the room where they both ended up at the end of each day. "Edward left the city," she said. Nathaniel looked up from the shipping report he wasn't really reading. "Good. He didn't even wait to see how the hearing came out," she said. Not with bitterness. With the slightly wondering tone of someone observing a fact that reveals more about a person than any deliberate confession could. "He just went." "A man like Bellamy calculates exits before he commits to anything," Nathaniel said. "He had the exit planned before he ever sent the letter." She thought about that. "You knew what he was from the beginning, didn't you?" "I knew the type." He set the report down. "I said nothing because it wasn't my place." "Would you say something now?" He looked at her directly. "I would say you were not wrong to trust him. You were working with the information you had. He was simply very careful to control what information you had." He paused. "That is not a failure of your judgment. It is a measure of his deliberate dishonesty." Clara held his gaze for a moment. "That is the kindest thing you've said to me. It is also the most accurate," he said. "I don't do kindness as a separate exercise from accuracy." She smiled, a real one, the kind that arrived before she could decide whether to allow it. It happened more often now. She was learning to stop trying to prevent it. "Nathan," she said. He waited. "After the hearing," she said. "Whatever happens, I want to talk about what this is." I understood what she meant. She could see it in his face, the precise comprehension of a man who had been thinking about the same question from his own side of it. "Yes," he said. "After the hearing." The hearing lasted 4 hours. Clara sat in the second row with Ruth on one side and an empty seat on her other, that Nathaniel had left to stand at the back of the room with Graves near the door in the position of a man who was present without appearing to manage the proceedings, because they had agreed together that this hearing needed to be Clara's case, and Clara's testimony, not the intervention of a wealthy husband on behalf of a vulnerable wife. She testified for 40 minutes. She was precise, sequential, and entirely without emotion, not because she didn't feel it, but because she had made a decision weeks ago that the facts were stronger than the feelings, and the facts needed room to breathe. Mrs. Hooper testified for 20 minutes and said 3 things that the room would not forget. Foster testified for 35 minutes with 8 years of documented evidence and the careful, detailed memory of a man who had been watching and waiting for the moment when telling the truth became possible. Mercer's solicitor argued for an hour. He was skilled, thorough, and working with a set of facts that had been comprehensively dismantled before he stood up. The board withdrew to deliberate at 2:30. They returned at 4 o'clock. The finding was in favor of the complainants on 4 of 5 counts. Mercer and Sons was ordered to return the Whitmore warehouse deed to the estate of Thomas Whitmore, pending his return from Baltimore. Financial restitution to Mrs. Hooper and Mr. Webb was referred to the civil court for calculation. The Harbor Board member most closely associated with Mercer's interests resigned from his seat before the end of the business day. Clara heard the finding read aloud and sat very still with her hands folded in her lap. Ruth put a hand over hers and didn't say anything. Clara did not cry. She had decided she wasn't going to, and she was a woman who kept her decisions. But she pressed Ruth's hand back once firmly and sat with the weight of the past 3 months settling into something she could finally put down. When she turned around, Nathaniel was at the back of the room watching her. Across the distance, over the heads of the people moving and talking and congratulating each other. He held her gaze with an expression she no longer had any difficulty reading. She stood up, walked to him. "Well," he said when she reached him. "Well," she said. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked out of the Harbor Board building and into the August afternoon, and Clara Whitmore Ashford walked out of that door, knowing that the woman who had stood in a cold Boston parlor 3 months ago and agreed to a marriage of practical necessity had arrived somewhere she had not planned for and could not have predicted, somewhere that looked in the afternoon light remarkably like a life worth living. The charity supper was her idea. She brought it to Nathaniel 2 weeks after the hearing, when Boston had finished rearranging its opinions, and the Ashford house had settled into a new rhythm. Warmer, more inhabited the servants, laughing at meals, and Samuel's music room open every afternoon, and fresh flowers in the east corridor that no one had ordered, but simply appeared the way good things began to appear in a house that had decided to be alive again. A public supper, she said, for families in debt trouble. Widows, small merchants, people caught in predatory arrangements like Mercer's. Not charity in the way Boston usually does charity, not a donation box at a church door. An actual supper. In this house. With real food and real conversation, and people treated as guests, not cases. Nathaniel listened. Did not interrupt. Did not reach for an objection. "It will cost money," she said. "I know. It will attract attention. Some of it will be the wrong kind." "I know that too." He looked at her steadily. "Are you asking my permission?" "I'm telling you my plan," she said. "Because we are operating from the same set of facts." Something in his expression opened the way a door opens that has been closed so long. The opening feels almost structural, a change in the house itself. "Then we host it together," he said. "Your plan. My name on the invitation beside yours." "Our name," she corrected. "Our name," he agreed. The supper was held on the last Saturday of August. 43 people came, widows, small merchants, 2 harbor clerks, 1 former warehouse owner who had lost everything to a lender, not unlike Mercer, and who ate his dinner with the careful, deliberate attention of a man who had not sat at a table like this in longer than he wanted to admit. Mrs. Hooper came. Mr. Webb came. Foster came with his wife and 2 of his 3 children, and the youngest one fell asleep in the front sitting room before the meal was finished, which Ruth discovered and reported to Clara, with an expression of such complete satisfaction that Clara had to turn away to conceal her own. At the end of the evening, when the guests had gone, and the servants were clearing, and the house was quiet in the full settled way of a place that has been properly used, Nathaniel found her in the hallway. "Come with me," he said. She followed him to the small chapel at the edge of the east garden. Not a public building, just the private room that the Ashford family had used for generations, for moments that required something more deliberate than ordinary speech. He had put a candle on the table. Nothing else. No ceremony, no audience, no performance. He stood across from her in the candlelight and said, "I made you a promise in a ruined parlor in June. I said I would give you my name and legal protection and warmth and food and a household that functioned." He paused. "I did not say I would give you myself, because I did not believe I had anything worth giving. I was wrong about that." Clara held very still. "I am not a man who speaks this easily," he said. "You know that. So understand that what I am about to say has been true for longer than I have been saying it." He looked at her with no composure left. Nothing held back, simply a man standing in the honest light of what he felt. "I married you because I thought you needed saving. But you were the one who saved this house. You saved it before I understood it needed saving. And you did it without asking permission, and without waiting for me to be ready, and without once letting me believe that you were doing it for anything other than your own genuine conviction that a house with sealed rooms and a dead fireplace was a waste of a perfectly good life." Clara's voice when it came was steady. Barely. "Nathan, I love you," he said, simply, without decoration. "I want to renegotiate every term of this arrangement on that basis if you are willing." She looked at him across the candlelight for a long moment, at the man who had walked into a ruined parlor with his hat in his hand and offered her cold logic when she needed survival, and who had become through the slow and honest work of 2 people learning each other without flinching something she had not allowed herself to hope for. "I've been willing," she said, "since the morning I found the flower in Samuel's music room." He crossed to her in 2 steps. He took her hands, both of them carefully, the way he held everything that mattered. And Clara Whitmore, who had been abandoned and ruined, and written off by a city that measured women in dowries and family names, and the quality of their disasters, stood in the Ashford chapel in the last warmth of an August evening, and understood with the full, unguarded certainty of a woman who had earned every word of it that she was exactly where she had chosen to be, not rescued, not restored, not return to some earlier version of herself that the scandal had damaged. Remade. On her own terms. In partnership with a man who had learned slowly, painfully, and with her patient and impatient help, that love was not a weakness to be avoided, but a courage to be practiced every day in every room of a house that had finally completely, and without reservation, come back to life.